Hello, and welcome to the channel. In this video we're going to cover some common problems with the Mitsubishi Mirage. If this helps you out, please consider liking this video. Let's start off with rattles and squeaks. The most common cause of rattles is often the air cleaner. One thing you can do to try and prevent or slow this happening is to put a zip tie on the air intake snorkel and secure it gently to the wiring harness below it. The rubber bushings that hold the air cleaner assembly in place can also wear out over time. These can be replaced easily enough. If they're worn to the point that the mount holes are oblonged, you can sometimes push the metal sleeve from the bushing and add some washers to help hold the air cleaner down securely, or replace the entire air cleaner assembly. For the exhaust rattles, there are a few heat shield fasteners that rust away, causing the heat shield to rattle. In most cases you can either remove the heat shield altogether or use a metal hose clamp to secure them. If you have a 2017 to 2018 or 2019 Mirage, you might experience an annoying resonance or vibration while accelerating gently. The most common cause for this is a worn-out rubber exhaust hanger. It sounds hard to believe, but it happens. In 2017, Mitsubishi redesigned the catalytic converter, making it integral to the exhaust manifold. This made the exhaust more rigid. In turn, it appeared to transmit more movement through the exhaust and wearing out the rubber hanger just ahead of the right-hand rear wheel. This can be fixed by either replacing the rubber hanger or even just removing it from the body and wrapping tape around the peg that it mounts to, making the rubber fit tighter. The newer Mirages used an updated hanger and don't seem to have this issue. Now let's move on to squeaks. The most common squeak, or chirp, tends to be the belt. When it gets loose or worn out, it starts to chirp. These cars use a manual belt tensioner, so require occasional belt adjustments. This is really easy to do yourself with a 12 and 14 mm. If the car is older and in a climate where rust is common, make sure to use some penetrating oil on the adjustment bulb because they tend to break if they're not used often. One less common squeak can be caused by the exhaust flange. This applies more to 2014 and 2015 models with higher miles or where rust is common. The exhaust gaskets that seal the catalytic converter can form rust on the seal and start to cause some annoying squeaks or chirping. You can fix this by unbolting the converter and replacing the gaskets. Exhaust gaskets for these cars can usually be found on Rock Auto. Next we'll talk about a no-start scenario. Specifically, when the engine cranks over but won't start. The most common cause of this is the engine is flooded. A lot of the time you can crank the engine over while holding the throttle pedal to the floor and it'll start. If that doesn't work, open the hood and remove the fuel pump fuse and try again. Reinsert fuse after 5 to 10 seconds of cranking. This method works nearly every time. One way to prevent this from happening in the first place is to not start the car when cold, then shut it off shortly after without driving it or revving it up slightly. These cars run very rich when cold and can flood easily if started and stopped numerous times in a short time. If your battery is getting weak, you increase the likelihood of having this issue. I won't get into testing the battery or starter because I'm only covering stuff that's specific to the Mirage. Those tests are pretty universal. And now we'll move on to some warning lights. We'll start with the battery light. The alternators in these cars can often last well over 300,000 miles or 5,000 kilometers, but when the battery light comes on, most people replace the alternator then wonder why the light is still on. The most common reason for the battery light that I've ran into with the Mirage is a broken wire in the engine wiring harness. It can be tricky to find if you don't know where to start. The wiring harness that runs along the top of the intake manifold is held in place by 3 zip ties. Over time the zip ties tend to wear the insulation on the wires out and sometimes the wire as well. Other times the wire will corrode from the inside and it can be hard to find where. I unplug the gray connector at the alternator and use a small screwdriver or pick to loosen off the zip ties securing the harness. Then cut the black tape holding the harness together so you can inspect each wire carefully. The small red wire tends to be the one that breaks first for some reason. The battery light will turn on if the alternator isn't charging at all or is overcharging, typically at around 15 volts. Both problems can be caused by one broken wire and there'll be nothing wrong with the alternator at all. The brake warning light can cause some confusion. Sometimes people think the light is simply a reminder that the parking brake was left on and there's just a minor problem with the switch on the handbrake. While the brake warning light does turn on when the handbrake is engaged, it is also designed to turn on if the brake fluid level drops to a potentially unsafe level, if there's a potential leak, or other possible brake malfunction. The fluid level sensor in the Mirage's brake fluid reservoir can trigger the warning light to come on even when the fluid appears to be in the max and minimum marks. The light may flash when the fluid drops to around the halfway mark. It's normal for the fluid level to drop as the brakes wear over time, but if the fluid level is nearing the low or halfway mark in the reservoir, You may notice the brake light flashing under hard cornering or braking. If you notice either of those things, you should have your brakes checked out. If the brake light stays on constantly, you might have other problems, such as a leaking hose, wheel cylinder, or caliper. If that's the case, stop it, get some help. Next up, we'll get into some simple reasons the traction control warning lights and ABS warning lights may turn on. First off, if you own a 2014 or 2015 Mirage, do not replace the OEM-style brake light bulbs with LED bulbs. They might work fine for a short while, but you will end up with trouble lights and sometimes drivability problems. The same problems can occur if both brake light bulbs burn out. Most people don't check their brake light bulbs, so this is becoming more of a common problem as these cars are now 10 years old. Another somewhat common reason an ABS warning light may turn on could be if a wheel speed sensor wire is damaged. The rear sensors are more common to give problems because they're more exposed to the elements and more vulnerable to damage. But don't go blindly replacing random parts without checking for trouble codes and doing some simple tests. One other reason I have seen traction control lights turn on has been while having a device plugged into the OBD2 port. I installed GPS trackers in Mirages, and slowly each car developed a no-throttle scenario at the worst possible time while driving. Usually while trying to make a left turn. It took a while and even multiple trips to the dealer before it was discovered that the OBD tracker was the cause of all these problems. In the end, the company that sold the devices admitted that they never tested them on Mitsubishis but had a lot of similar issues with Subarus. I recently installed some trackers sold by a different company and they worked flawlessly in the Mirages. Some devices work fine, like the ScanGauge products, but some other devices might not. If you own or are considering buying a Mirage with a CVT, you may have already heard of the infamous blinking shift indicator. The shift indicator on the instrument cluster may start to flash while driving. This indicates there is a problem with the CVT. A quick flashing D that blinks every second means the CVT fluid temperature is too hot. What a lot of people don't seem to know is a blinking shift indicator can also mean something else. If it blinks slower, once every 2 seconds, that means there is a trouble code stored in the transmission control unit. In either case, it could be costly to repair. Depending on the trouble codes, you may get away lucky and just have a bad speed sensor, dirty fluid, or maybe even a plugged cartridge filter. Worst case, it might need a valve body or entire transmission replacement. It's sometimes more cost-effective to buy a used low-mileage CVT from an auto wrecker than to gamble with a new valve body only to find out you still have other issues with the transmission. Be sure to do some more research on the topic if you have this issue. One thing you can do to help prevent transmission problems is to change the fluid every 30,000 miles or 50,000 kilometers. There's also a paper filter on the side of the case, and a metal strainer that's accessed via the oil pan. If you haven't subscribed yet, maybe consider it. Legend has it that those that don't tend to suffer from premature CVT failures for some weird reason, along with random cases of explosive diarrhea. Last but not least is a weird problem I ran into that mainly affected mostly some 2015 and older Mirages. Out of the blue, multiple warning lights on the instrument cluster would turn on. Sometimes they would flash on and off. There were sometimes drivability problems as well. It took a bit to figure this one out. The typical cause of this problem ended up being corrosion on a connector behind the driver's kick panel. Snow and salt would get tracked into the car in the winter months, getting in behind the kick panel and work its way into the wiring connections. This would typically affect the lowermost connector, but in some cases could affect the others. Usually the corrosion was pretty obvious, but in some cases, not so much. It's worth pointing out that even the slightest traces of corrosion on a connector or wire can make these cars act haywire. Mitsubishi did come out with a recall regarding this problem. I learned firsthand that even if this recall has been performed, there's still a chance this problem can occur. Hopefully some of this will help someone out. Thanks for watching.